Calnon from Meridian, Idaho, and as a World War II veteran, these are some of my experiences at that time. In 1941, all Europe was at war, and we were pretty sure that we'd get in it eventually, and so the draft was in effect, and my number was getting awful close, and I knew I didn't want to pack a rifle, so I volunteered for the Air Corps. At that time, the Air Corps was just another branch of the Army. The first thing, they sent me to Salt Lake City for induction, and then on to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. Jefferson Barracks was just merely a assembly point waiting for assignment. There they decided to send me to weather observer school, but at that time all the schools were full, so they sent me to Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico for in-service training. This was real enjoyable. You attended class in the morning and then worked on weather maps in the afternoon. But at that time, a buck private made $21 a month. And I couldn't live in the manner in which I would like to live, so I was looking to get something different. I saw the advertising be a flying cadet for $75 a month, $300 a month when you were commissioned. I thought, well, I don't know what I have to do, but that's for me, so I signed up for it and eventually started in on pilot training. I went to primary training at Tulsa, Oklahoma. From there, went to basic training at Enid, Oklahoma, and finally in advanced training at Lubbock, Texas in twin-engine planes. During flight training, some of the instructors were rather interesting. In primary, my instructor's name was Mr. Jacobs. He was a real nice fellow, easy to get along with. But I remember the first thing he told me was that if I ever say to bail out, I don't want to have to tell you again because I'm not going to be here. Now in basic, my instructor was rather a reckless kind, and he did some things that were not exactly what he was supposed to do. For example, we were learning to fly formation, and he took us up into the clouds, and the student on the other wing lost sight of the instructor and came by under me and cut a hole in my plane. And from then on, of course, I had a different instructor, and whether he ever kept instructing or not, I don't know. In advance, our instructor was a former airline pilot that had been recalled, and I don't think he appreciated having to training us cadets, but one of his names was Jack, and he always had a smile on his face. And at that time, there was a cartoon character that was an aviator. His name, and he went by the name of Smiling Jack, and we used to refer to him as Smiling Jack. But he was real joy to work with, and I thoroughly enjoyed the twin-engine training. It wasn't long before I wound up at Ephrata, Washington, learning to fly B-17s. After we were through training in B-17s and I had my crew, we were off to England. We picked up a brand new B-17 and took off. We went to Presque Isle, Maine, and then Gander, Newfoundland. From there, we took off and flew across the Atlantic Ocean to Scotland. We almost had a disaster going across the ocean. I had the plane on automatic pilot, and we iced up. And at one time, the weather was rough that I decided to turn the automatic pilot off, and when I did, it just we were flying at night, so I couldn't see what was happening outside. But I caught the plane in time, and fortunately the plane still had the de-icer boots on, and was able to get the ice off and landed safely in Scotland. The one thing that impressed me in Scotland was the Scottish brogue is one of the most beautiful brogues that I had ever heard. Here they took our plane away from us, and I was assigned to the 384th Bomb Group. This, of course, was our first experience with British people. At that time, the British people did not look upon the Americans very kindly. It was one of those cases of overpaid, oversexed, and over here. But eventually they came around to accepting us, and so by the time we were well into war, why we were accepted as part of the war effort. When we were assigned to the 384th Bomb Group and got to the base, the first thing we realized was that this is one war that we weren't going to come out of unscathed. The casualties at that time were terrific. The average life of a combat crew at that time was 6 to 8 missions. This was in the summer and fall of 1942. It was early in the war. At that time, we had no fighter escort, so we were strictly on our own as far as defensive is concerned. We flew several missions, and nothing too drastic happened. We got shot up a little bit, but always got back. On our fateful mission, we bombed an aircraft factory at Anklam, Germany, which Anklam was just north of Berlin. We flew up across the North Sea, across Denmark, across the Baltic Sea, and down into Anklam. When we got back to Denmark, the German fighters were waiting for us, and that's when we first got hit. We got hit, and it jammed some of the controls, and of course knocked us out of the formation. Once you're out of the formation, why, it's all over with, because the fighters make sure that you go down. When it was obvious that we weren't going to make it, and the next thing I knew, the plane was on fire, I held the plane as level as I possibly could, and gave the order to bail out, and hoped that everyone had time to bail out. When it came time for me to bail out, your parachute is under the seat, and to get to the parachute harness, I had to take off my flak suit, flak vest, and May West, and finally got my parachute on. When when I let loose of the wheel to put my parachute on, the plane went into a flat spin. When everyone in a B-17 has a specific place to bail out, the pilot, co-pilot, and engineer go out to bomb bay. The engineer's responsibility is to pull a release that lets the bomb bay doors open on their own weight. After I got my chute on, I turned around to go out to bomb bay. The doors were closed. I didn't know why the engineer hadn't opened them, and he was nowhere in sight. I was later to find out that he did try to open the bomb bay doors, but they were shot up so much that they wouldn't open. He said he could see the ground through the doors. So he started across the catwalk to go back to the waist to bail out, and we got hit in the waist again, and it knocked him off the catwalk down on the bomb bay doors. Since they were unlatched, they opened up, let him out, and then closed back up again. He was wounded quite severely, but that's the way he got out of the plane. When I saw the bomb bay doors were closed, my next exit was down through the nose hatch. So I went down and bailed out the nose hatch, and of course all of this time I was being thrown around in the cockpit in the plane, and of course it was on fire, and once a plane catches fire, you're in big trouble. But I did get out, and I fell as long as I thought I possibly could, but I thought I could still hear the plane, and I kicked myself over on the back and looked up, and sure enough, here was a plane coming down in a flat spin right on top of me. Well, I waited as long as I dared and finally pulled the ripcord, and as the chute opened, the plane caught up with me, and the wing went past me about 10 or 15 feet from me, and I saw it stop turning, and which meant it hit the ground, and then I hit the ground. I started running when I hit the ground, and found that I was running up to a road, and there was a German soldier there. And so I was captured at that time, and he took me into a little village there, and my bombardier and co-pilot were already there, along with some other prisoners from other planes. And at that time I asked the Germans what about the rest of my crew, and that's when they told me that there were 3 of them dead and 3 wounded. So out of my crew of 10, there were only 4 of us that were not killed or wounded. And this was the beginning of over a year and a half as being a prisoner of war. When you're a prisoner of war, the procedure was they take you down to an interrogation center. This was located at Frankfurt, Germany. They put us on a train and took us down to Frankfurt. Here you were put in solitary confinement and taken out and interrogated. Of course, you know, the procedure is only name, rank, and serial number. They took me out, and I sat down at the table across from this officer, and he gave me a form to fill out. Across the top it said International Red Cross, and it asked some questions, where you were born, your hometown, a few insignificant questions, and then got down to what kind of a plane you were in, where were you in the formation, and those kind of things. And at that time, I told the officer, I said, this is as far as I can go. And he said, oh no, he said, you have to answer all of it. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but that's it. So he pulled out his pistol and he pointed it at me. And he said, now I can shoot you anytime I want because no one knows where you are or what's happened to you. Well, I didn't think he would do it. But had I see him shoot someone and then turn to me, I don't know what I would have done. But I did learn afterwards that there are some things you did do and didn't do. You did give them your name, rank, and serial number, but you didn't get smart with them or lie to them. If you did, they could make you wish you'd never been born. But they would accept the fact that you wouldn't talk because they knew what your orders were. So while at Frankfurt, I did get a little indication of what might be coming. One day they were bringing a group of prisoners down the street just outside the camp, and there was a pile of cans out there from food that from the camp. And when these prisoners saw this pile of trash, why, they just made it beelines over to it, and they'd pick up these cans and run their fingers around the can and pick up what kind of food and juice there was in the can, which gave you an indication of just how hungry they were. After they were through with you at Frankfurt, then they sent you to the main prison camp. There were two main prison camps for flying officers. One was Stalag Luft 3 at Sagen, Germany, which was 90 miles from Berlin. The other one was Stalag Luft 1, which was at Barth, which was up on the Baltic Sea. They sent me to Stalag Luft 3. At that time, the camp was divided into 5 compounds: north, south, east, west, and center. I was assigned to center compound. At the end of the war, there were 2,000 prisoners in each compound. So there were 10,000 prisoners at Stalag Luft 3. These also included British airmen. And this was only one camp, so it gives you an indication of how much the losses were. When you were in the camp, you were assigned to barracks, and in these barracks, the barracks were divided into what they call combines. The bunks were set in squares, and this was a little group that you lived with. You got your food in this group, and when I got there, there were 8 in my combine. By the end of the war, there were 14. There were about 6 or 8 of these combines in each barracks. Now, the food we had at Stalag Luft 3, the first year, the food was adequate, but not because of what the Germans gave us. We lived on Red Cross parcels. The International Red Cross was allowed to send food parcels in to us. These food parcels contain 12 pounds of food, and a parcel went to one man a week. And the parcel included things like corned beef, Spam, chocolate bar, dried fruit, cookies, and that was adequate. The Germans did give us some food. They gave us barley soup, which was edible if you didn't mind picking the weevil out of it. They gave us bread, a real heavy brown bread, which we were suspicious contained sawdust. And after the war, it was confirmed that there was a certain percentage of sawdust in it. We got boiled potatoes, dirt, skin, and all, but they were edible. The one thing they gave us that I never could eat was what they called blood sausage. It was made exactly what it sounded like, out of pure blood. It came in a roll about that big around, and you could slice it and almost spread it like peanut butter. I was never able to down it, and I saw very few people that could, regardless of how hungry we got. We got these food parcels the first year, and then we went on half parcels for about 3 months, and then when they moved us for the camp, then there was practically no food at all. You may wonder what we did with our time. Actually nothing. There was a perimeter that most of us would just go out and walk around hour after hour to kind of keep in shape. But we did have athletic equipment. The YMCA and the Red Cross could send in athletic equipment, musical instruments, paperback books. So we did have things that you could do. The Red Cross and the YMCA were trying to make things as comfortable as possible. As far as mail is concerned, the Germans gave us 4 postcards and 3 letters, formed letters, a month. And this way you could, and you had to write in pencil, and you couldn't write between the lines. Of course, everything was censored, so really there's not much you could say other than we're doing fine and hope you are too. It took about 3 to 4 months for a letter to get either in or out. We did get mail from home, and we could also get parcels from home. And of course, thing was to send things that were not perishable and would stand the shipment. But of course, anything from home was appreciated. I've had people ask me if there was too much pressure all the time. The only pressure was, or how much fear you had. The main thing was fear of the future. The problem was you knew what the Germans could do to you. We were aware of the concentration camp, the gas chambers, and the ovens. In fact, occasionally American prisoners would be taken to the concentration camp. And at one time, the Luftwaffe went down and got some American prisoners out of Buchenwald and brought them up to Stalag 3. And they were taken out of Buchenwald the day before they were to be put in the gas chambers. So we were aware of what could happen to us and what was going on. There were humorous things that happened at camp. It wasn't all boredom. One that I remember particularly, in fact, Colonel Spivey, who was our senior American officer, writes about it in his book. He tells about sitting in his room and looking over at a barracks and seeing the prisoners running back and forth to the cookhouse with pitchers of boiling water. And he said, I'd like to think that they were just being nice little Kriegies and cleaning out their barracks, but he said, I knew that was too good to be true. But pretty soon, one of the head ferrets, now the ferrets were Germans that were dressed in coveralls that just snooped around the camp. They were not armed, and they were just looking to see if there's any activities going on that they shouldn't be. The head ferret came bursting into Colonel Spivey's office and or room, and he said, I knew it was something had to do with that barracks over there, so he said, I went over there, and what was happening was that the prisoners had caught a ferret under their barracks. The barracks are built about 3 feet off the ground so that they could see whether any tunnels were being dug. They'd caught this ferret under there, and they were boiling water on him through the cracks in the floor of the barracks. He couldn't come out because they had fellows stationed around the barracks with more boiling water, and he wasn't armed, so there was really nothing he could do. So Colonel Spivey went over and said I reluctantly had to put a stop to it. Another occasion, this happened on Christmas. In the Red Cross parcel, there was dried fruit, and with Yankee ingenuity, a group of fellows started fermenting them, and they made their moonshine. And this one Christmas morning, one morning, we kept hearing this, Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas. Here, these guys had broken out their booze, and they were just drunker than skunks. They went over to the guardrail, which is about 25 feet from the main wire on the compound, and it was the area that you were not supposed to step over. If you were, you could get shot. They went up to the guardrail. One of them stepped over the guardrail and with his can of whiskey and went up to the guard tower and started climbing up the fence up to the guard tower to give the guard a drink. Of course, the guard knew that he was drunk, and so fortunately didn't shoot him, but the prisoner got up on top of the fence and fell over on the other side of the barbed wire. Of course, now he was out of the compound, which is definitely a no-no. Well, there were German soldiers on the other side that was watching all of this, so they picked him up and started him up the wire again, got him up on top, and he fell over on the campsite. And so by that time, some of his friends hurried out and picked him up and got him back safely in the compound. I'm always asked if I tried to escape. Well, I didn't, but there were fellows that did want to try to escape. The procedure was they had an escape committee, and if you thought you had a plan to escape, you went to this escape committee to get permission. And if they thought you had a snowball chance at all of escaping, they would give you permission. If they could get you anything you wanted, they could get you money, they could get you maps, they could get you compasses, they get you train tickets, anything you wanted. The way they got these things was there were certain guards that they knew could be bribed. And at that time, the Germans, of course, were short a novelty to them with cigarettes and chocolate bars. And the escape committee knew which guards could be bribed. Some of the guards would sell out their own mother for a few cigarettes or chocolate bars. One of the common ways, there were fellows that did get outside the camp, but they didn't get, they were always picked up in just a matter of a day or so. The most common way of trying to escape was to tunnel. Well, the Germans knew that we were digging tunnels, but none of them ever succeeded, so they weren't particularly worried about them. The problem in digging a tunnel was how do you get rid of the fresh dirt? Because if the Germans saw fresh dirt around, they knew you were digging tunnels. One of the most successful way of getting rid of the dirt was they'd take sleeves of a shirt and run them down their pant leg, and with a string down at the bottom, and fill the pant leg with dirt, and then go out around the perimeter where everyone was walking, and dribble the dirt around the perimeter, and the other fellows would just kick it in. Another successful way that worked for a while was, believe it or not, the YMCA sent us in garden seed. So the Germans gave us permission to plant a garden. So the fellows would spade up the ground just outside their barracks, and the Germans would loan us shovels with the understanding that they were not to be used to dig tunnels, and they never were. The fellows would start spading up the ground, and the fellow digging the tunnel would dump the dirt there, and the fellows would spade it in. This worked real fine until the garden got about that much higher than the surrounding ground, and of course they knew we were digging tunnels, and they would find them. The way they'd find them would be to drive wagons around the area, or they'd take big long probes and probe down, because the ground was real sandy, and they'd always find the tunnels. Now, one tunnel that did work that was not in our compound but was in the compound next to us was the one you read about and see in the movies, The Great Escape. This was a British effort, and they did get they started digging 3 tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry, with the idea that one was discovered, they'd still have another one. Well, Harry was successful, and they were planning on getting 200 men out of the camp. Well, when the night of the escape, there was an air raid, so they doubled the guards around the perimeter, and the tunnel came up short of the woods where they expected. Well, they got 76 men out before they were discovered. Within the next few days, all of them were picked up except three. There's three of them that did make it back to England. The rest of them, as I say, were all picked up. Now, 50 of them they took out and shot. They cremated them and brought the ashes back to Stalag Luft 3 and said, "This is what happens when you escape." This kind of put a damper on escaping activity, but there still was some efforts made. The three that made it back to England knew the language and knew the country, so they were the only ones that even had a chance of it being successful. People ask if we knew what was going on in the war. Well, we had a radio, and they would tune in to the BBC and get the news and then pass it around to the different barracks to read. The radio, when I got there, I knew there was a radio in camp, but I didn't know where it was. After the war, Colonel Spivey in his book told where and how they got this radio. There was a prisoner went over to the so-called hospital, which was in the Borlager, which was just still in the prison camp, but outside of our compound. And there was a little hospital there, and they kept the Red Cross parcels and those kind of things there. When they got ready to bring the prisoner back to the camp, to the compound, as he went by, he noticed a radio on the table there that the guards were listening to. He picked it up and put it under his coat and brought it back to the camp. When they got it back to camp, they immediately took it all apart and hid the parts all over camp. And of course, the guard reported it missing, and so there was immediately a search, but by that time they had everything hidden. So that's the way they got the radio. The way they kept it hidden in these little compounds or combines, there was a table that had the legs were made out of 4x4s. What they did was hollowed out the top of one of these 4x4s and took the radio part, put it down in there with two wires extending up through the top of the table with two nails there. And the receiver or the earphone they just kept out because, of course, it was small. All they had to do to get the radio working was to run a wire from the electric wire down to these two nails. So that's the way they kept the radio hidden all of those years. There were always activities going on in the camp that maybe you didn't want the Germans to know about, like reading the news or making some kind of escape material. As I say, the ferrets were always roaming around camp and listening. The prisoners had a name for these ferrets. We called them goons. The Germans asked what a goon was. They were told that goon stood for German officer or non-com. They accepted that, so there was no problem. Toward the end of January of 1945, we began hearing guns. We knew what that was. That was the Russians approaching. The question was, what are they going to do with us? Are they going to try to move us or let the Russians take us or just do away with the camp? we had learned later that the order did come down to just eliminate the camp, but fortunately cooler heads prevailed. So the Germans decided to move us. This we were somewhat prepared for. We had been told to hoard what food we could and make a backpack. So everyone made a backpack out of a shirt. They sewed up the front and the bottom and sewed the arms down to the waist, and that was your backpack. On February 28th, at night, the order came to be ready to move in 30 minutes. So we got our backpacks out, and the Germans started us down the road. This winter was the worst winter that the continent had seen in decades. At this time, there was a blizzard, there was a foot of snow on the ground, and sub-zero weather. They started us down the road. We marched all that night, all the rest of the day. And that next night, they tried to get us out of the weather. We came to a little town, and there was a church there that was built for 600 people. They put all of my compound, all 2,000 men, in this one little church. And you can imagine the shape that church was in when we left the next morning, because we were muddy, we were wet, some of the men were sick, but we were out of the weather. Later on, my compound raised money and went back and redid this little church. We started out the next morning, and we were out about 10 days. We would sleep in barns, or one time we were up in a top of a brick factory, any place to get us out of the weather. Eventually we came to a town called Spremberg. Here they put us on these 40 and 8 box cars, 40 men or 8 horses. They put 50 to 60 men in each box car. So you can imagine how crowded it was. We were on in these box cars for 3 days and 3 nights. They stopped once to let us out. They took us down to a prison camp called Moosberg. Now, Moosberg was about 30 miles north of Munich. They were gathering prisoners from all over Germany at this camp because they were running out of territory. When the war ended, there were over 100,000 prisoners of all nationalities at this camp. Here there was no food, there was no heat. All you could do is just sit and wait. Toward the end of April, we began hearing guns again. Of course, this time we knew it was the American army approaching. The question was, again, what are they going to do with us? There's no way they could move 100,000 prisoners. They had enough trouble moving 10,000. So we wondered what was going to happen. The weather was fairly decent at this time of year, and we kind of got in the habit of just sitting outside the long side of the barracks listening to the war. We'd see our planes go over, and they'd dip their wings as they went over, so we knew that they knew we were there. On one morning we got up and went outside and to listen to the war, and there was not a sound. All that night before, we had heard trucks and tanks going up and down the road. So, but we didn't know, were they going up to defend the camp or were they retreating? Well, we looked up in the guard towers and there were no guards there. So we knew something was going to happen, and soon. Well, at 9 o'clock sharp, a P-51 circled the camp and began strafing on the outside of the camp. About that same time, all hell broke loose. The Americans on one side of us started firing over the camp into Moosberg, and the Germans in Moosberg started firing over the camp at the Americans. And for 3 hours, we sat in no man's land with Germans shooting one way and the Americans shooting the other. I have been told that a few stray shells came in the camp, but none that I saw. We could look down at Moosberg and see the courtyard down there. Well, at 12 o'clock, we could see the flagpole down there that a swastika has been on all of that time. And at noon, we saw the swastika go down and the American flag go up. So we knew that finally the war was over for us. And about that same time, a tank burst through the gate and came in the camp to see if there was any Germans in there. But that was the end of the war for us. After the liberation, we were flown out of Moosberg to Camp Lucky Strike, which was at Le Havre, and there we were deloused and checked back in with the military. We were put on ships and sent back to the States. I eventually went to Santa Monica, California for R&R. Here I was told I would be put in B-29s and sent to the Pacific because, of course, the war was still going on there. While I was at Santa Monica, the war there ended, and I had the choice of staying in the military or getting a discharge. I really enjoyed flying, but I felt that I'd had all the military and definitely all the war that I wanted, so I opted for the discharge. After the discharge, I went back home and began working for the University of Idaho Extension Service. I never got to take advantage of the GI Bill because I already had my education and didn't need a home, so I didn't get any of those benefits. You always make lasting friendships after going through these kind of experiences. Mine were those that I made with my crew members and fellows that I was prisoners of war with. I kept in contact with my crew members that survived, and at the present time, 2 of my crewmen are still alive, which we correspond and live up old times again. After the war, of course, I did enjoy flying, and they formed a National Guard unit here in Boise. At that time, they were flying P-51s. I had never flown a P-51, so I wanted to have that experience. It was far different from flying a B-17, but I'll still take my B-17 any time. Stalag Lift 3 held reunions after the war and in different parts of the states. It was an opportunity to see your fellow prisoners, and my 4 officers was the one time that we could all get together and talk over old times. At the present time, there are no reunions just because we're all getting too old for them and too old to travel, but we still keep in touch with those that we have met at the reunions. When I think back over my military career, it's one of those things that you wouldn't want to take the chance again for $1 million, but you wouldn't take $1 million for the experience. As far as my opinion of the military and war, I have a very favorable opinion of the military, and anyone that is in the military and serves in combat has my greatest respect. And when you think about things on your life now, it makes you realize that life is a little more precious. For the past 10 years, I have spoken to classes at school about my war experiences. I think my greatest disappointment is how little the present generation knows about World War II. They haven't the slightest inkling of what happened in those days and what some of us went through.